Emotions are an interesting thing. We all have them, regardless of how much you think you're a thinker instead of a feeler, you still have emotions. And the reality of our emotions is that they dictate how we think a lot of times and even how we feel physically. Emotions are the one thing that when you have an emotion, you have a physical response to it. Think of the last time you were afraid of something and you felt that adrenaline rush and your legs started hurting, your respiration increased and your chest started to feel tight because you have a physical response to an emotional feeling, and it's a pretty crazy thing. Can you imagine having a crippling fear of something? They call them phobias. It's not just being afraid of something, it's being cripplingly afraid of something. Like, for instance, how about this one? Having cathosophobia is the fear of sitting. That would be a rough one, right? I mean, my knees would hurt a lot. I don't know if you're afraid of everyone else sitting or if you're just afraid of you sitting, or if it's both, that would be terrible. I don't know about that one. How about this one? The fear of shellfish is ostraconophobia, the fear of shellfish. These people don't ever get to go to the amazing place that is Red Lobster and get those amazing biscuits because they're afraid of the shellfish. They're afraid of the lobsters in the tank up front. That would be not fun. I don't think that would be an enjoyable fear to have. How about this one? Genophobia is the fear of knees. I hope you're not afraid of your own knees, because that would be terrible. Like, sitting down to go to the bathroom would be terrifying, especially if you have the fear of sitting and forget it. So that is a tough one. How about barophobia? If you're afraid of gravity, to have a crippling fear of gravity, that's tough. You're constantly wanting to jump, but then being afraid to land. That would be a tough one. How about this one? How about pentherophobia is the fear of mother-in-laws. I know some of you have this. I've heard people who have a fear of mother-in-laws, or at least their mother-in-law. I do not have that because I have a wonderful mother-in-law. I'm real thankful for her. And how about this one? The fear of being made fun of. If you have this one in gelatophobia, you've had a really hard time with the talk so far today because I've been making fun of you. But to be honest with you, we all have some fears, right? Maybe you had a fear like this one, ecclesiophobia, and that is the fear of going to church. Maybe you got over that fear and you showed up, or maybe the reason you're joining us online is because you're got a little bit of fear about going to church. And I want you to know that we are regular people just like you, everyday people trying to figure out how to take our next step toward Jesus. And that really is what this place is all about. But I have my own set of fears, and if I'm honest with you, sometimes they're crippling. Right, just this week I was at Home Depot and I'm standing in line, and the lady that was in front of me she just had this panic look on her face, and she says, "Do you know of anything they sell here that can help me with the snake that I saw in my garden this morning?" And I said, without hesitating, I said, "They sell for sale by owner signs over in the hardware department. I don't like snakes. Don't like snakes at all. But I don't have a crippling fear of snakes, because if I see a snake, you can know darn sure that I'll be running away. I will not be crippled. I will be mobile no matter how much. I'll pay the price later, but I'll be mobile for it, because I have a little bit, maybe just a touch of phytophobia, the fear of snakes, but probably doesn't, cripple me like it does some people, right? Now, here's one that if you have had any of those other ones, including the fear of being made fun of, if you have this one, you've had a hard time with the last several minutes. It's verbophobia, and it's the fear of words being mispronounced, because I pretty much mispronounced all those. In fact, the only thing I'm pretty sure I pronounced right is phobia. So the first parts of it, have no clue. But to be fair, you don't probably have a clue either, so as long as I just pronounce it with confidence, you'll be fine. For the last several weeks, we've been talking about what these things are that hold us back, right? We want to grow in our faith. We want to move forward in our faith. But there are some things, sometimes the lower parts down here, where we live every single day in our lives. We talked about the first fear, or the first thing that kind of gets over our life, is getting past our past. Sometimes we're like, man, if I don't have a firm footing on how to move forward past the past parts of my story, then I can't really keep growing and moving forward in my faith. I can't be a good husband or a good father or a good employee. I can't grow in my faith because sometimes my past is what cripples me. And that's a big deal. We talked about that the first week, and then last week, Chris talked to us about getting past, or understanding how to get a firm footing when there is uncertainty in life. And that was a killer talk for me. Got to be honest with you. As I sat in the chairs you're sitting in last week, I was just impressed by how important it is that we have a firm footing when it comes to this issue in our life, when it comes to dealing with uncertainty, because we all deal with uncertainty every single day. And if we don't have a sure footing here, then we'll never be able to be the husband, the father, the wife, the mother, the friend, the follower of Jesus we want to be, because we're crippled by these places down here. Today, I want to talk to us about this last rung, about this last thing that's helping us as we kind of figure out how to go forward. And that is the thing that cripples most of us most often, because it's the issues we face when we face storms in our life. The storms that we face in life can sometimes cripple us. Like, we'll be going along just fine. Maybe this is your story. Maybe you've been like, I was doing really good in my faith, and I was really moving forward, and then all of a sudden that financial storm hit. Or maybe you were going, man, I was moving on in my faith, and I was trying to be a good dad, and I was trying to do this, and then all of a sudden that diagnosis, that medical storm hit. Or maybe you just a couple of weeks ago said, man, I'd love to kind of re-engage my faith story. Maybe you've been going in on it for the last 3 weeks. You've been really committed to being here. Maybe the reason you're here this morning is because you made that commitment, but then you found out this week that there was an employment struggle in your life, a storm in your life that's tough. Man, I got to be honest with you. If we don't find firm footing when it comes to our past, if we don't find firm footing when it comes to dealing with uncertainty, if we don't find firm footing when it comes to the storms that we deal with in life, the reality is that we'll stumble and fall, and our faith will unravel, right? Our ability to be a good husband or a good father, to be a good mom, a good wife, a good grandma, our ability to really stay faithful to the mission that God has for our lives will fall apart because we fall through these vital rungs in our life. So there's this story we've been walking through in Matthew chapter 14. We kind of walk through these stories and help rebuild these platforms or these rungs in the ladder for us. And last week, Chris kind of wrapped up the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 when they faced the uncertainty and all the things that were there. And he wrapped it up, and there was a point at the very end of it when the people were responding to Jesus in such a way that they were super excited about what he did. They just saw him do this giant magic trick, right? Take 5 little loaves and a couple of fish and feed thousands and thousands of people. And so all of a sudden now, they were like gonna take him to be their king. And one version of scripture, one perspective on it in the book of John says they were about to take him by force. Now, Jesus wanted to be their king, but he didn't want to be their political king. He wanted to be their spiritual king. And they were going to take him by force and accomplish their political agenda with him. But then here's what happened next. And this might mess with you. Immediately after that, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. He's like, look, these people are going to take me by force. You guys get in the boat and start paddling to the other side. I'm going to take care of things here. And he set the people straight. But here's what's important. Jesus insisted that his disciples get back in the boat. Another version, another translation of the Bible says that he compelled them. Like literally the word that's kind of used to say he insisted is one that he would literally do it by force if necessary. He made them get in the boat. But here's what's interesting about it. It's not just that he made them get into the boat, but Jesus knew exactly what they were going to face when they got out there. Jesus knew that they were going to get halfway across and they were going to face a storm in life, like we've been talking about. They weren't going to face a financial storm or a job storm or a medical storm. They were going to face a real storm. And here's the question. Why did Jesus insist on them getting into the boat if he knew full well what they were going to face when they got there? I think that no sermon is complete, it seems like, without one Warren Wiersbe quote or another. And he said it this way: a faith that cannot be tested is a faith that cannot be trusted. That's an important thing for us to wrap our minds around when we talk about facing storms, because often the storms in life are given to us to test and reassure and then even reinforce our faith. And our story needs to change, because if we're going to have firm footing on this, we need to understand the difference when we see a storm in life. Now listen, I want to make sure we understand there's a difference between facing a storm in life and then facing the inevitable consequences of our own actions, right? It's not a storm when you do something wrong and wind up in jail, right? That's not a storm in life. That's you just paying the consequences for what you've chosen to do. The same thing's true in our life. When we face the consequences of our own actions, it's not the same. But sometimes, many times, God provides difficult circumstances in our life to reinforce, to even assure us and to give us confidence in when we're facing the storm. Look at what another thing that Warren Wiersbe says. He says it this way: suffering will either be your master or your servant, depending on how you handle the crisis. After all, this is important, a crisis doesn't make a person, it reveals what a person is made of. A crisis, a storm, doesn't make a person, it reveals what a person is made of. That's really what God wants us to get in this idea, is going, hey, listen, I want to change the thing about you that is riddled in fear. I want to change the part of you that when you respond to the storm, the part of you that's crippled. And that's how it feels to us, isn't it? When we go through a relational storm, like a marriage issue, when we go through a financial storm, an educational storm, right? A job storm. When you face these issues in our lives, we have a tendency to be crippled in fear when there's a big problem in front of us. And God's saying, listen, I want to provide storms in your life where I'm standing there with you and I can change that which you are made of. God wants to change the composition of who we are in storms. So sometimes he provides us things. Now it's difficult for us to figure out, but the disciples in this story were like out doing their thing. They got in the boat like they were told to, and they started rowing, and look at what it says. It says that the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting the heavy waves. That's a pretty descriptive way of saying it, right? They were fighting it. They were rowing. They were doing the things that they were supposed to do to try and make progress, but they were not moving forward. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever felt like things were moving forward and you're doing all the work to move forward, but things weren't progressing? You ever feel like you're beating your head against a wall when it comes to your relationships? When in your marriage, you ever felt like you were just going, I'm doing all the work here, but we're not seeing none of the progress? We're being honest with each other. We're trying hard, but it just seems like we're fighting an uphill battle. That's what they were facing, an uphill battle that seemed to make absolutely no progress. It says this, it was like late into the night. They've been doing this for hours, and about 3 o'clock in the morning, it says, Jesus came toward them. And this is the tripped out part, right? Walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. And in their fear, they cried out, it's a ghost. Like, that's exactly what happens to us, isn't it? We don't cry out, it's a ghost. But in our fear, we make some pretty ridiculous things. Because in our fear, we tend to catastrophize, don't we? I don't even know if that's a word, catastrophize, but I think it is. I think it's a word. But when we're afraid, don't you have a tendency to do that? To make everything a catastrophe? Like they'd been exhausted and they were tired and they were afraid and they were out in the middle and there's this guy walking on the water, which, let's face it, is a little scary. And they had a tendency to catastrophize things. Do you ever feel like that's what happens to you? Like when you're afraid, don't you go, man, what happens if this doesn't work out? What happens if this doesn't work out, then that won't work out. And if that doesn't work out, this won't work out. If that doesn't work out, this is going to happen. You happen to do that about every other year in November? Well, if we don't get this senator, if we don't get those people, if we don't get this person in the White House, the whole thing's going to fall apart. And if we don't have this problem, if this doesn't happen in our town, then that doesn't happen in our town. If this doesn't happen in our town, then it's all going to fall apart, right? When we're afraid, we tend to catastrophize. And that's one thing when it's Washington or, in some sort of state house. It's a whole other thing when it's in our life, isn't it? Like if this money doesn't come through, then that bill's not going to get paid. If that bill's not going to get paid, then this one's not going to get paid. And if that one's not going to get paid, we're going to be out on the street. And all we really are worried about is whether or not we can pay one bill. Don't we get afraid and then tend to catastrophize just like they did? They had a tendency to be afraid and then to let things be the worst they could be. It's a ghost. It's got to be a ghost. And the story goes on. Jesus responds to them, but Jesus spoke to them at once. Do not be afraid. Now, have you ever done that with somebody? Have you ever gone up to somebody and they're like, well, don't feel like that? Well, that's not a very nice thing to say, is it? Because when we sit down with somebody and they're afraid and you say, well, you shouldn't be afraid. Well, thanks for that. I appreciate that. And if that were all that Jesus said, that would be pretty rude. Don't feel like that. Don't do that. Like that, just saying that by itself, don't be afraid. That would be kind of rude, wouldn't it? But he doesn't just say that. He says this. He said, take courage. I am here. Don't be afraid. Have courage. I am here. Now listen, when I was a kid, or when the girls were kids, they would be scared of something. Let's say it was a monster under the bed, or if the closet door was open just a little bit, or if they heard a noise, right? Then when we come into the room, we don't tell them, don't be afraid. You shouldn't be afraid. What do you say? Hey, Daddy's here. Mommy's here. I'm here. And whatever's out there that you're afraid of, I'm bigger than whatever's out there. Whatever's under there or whatever's in there, I can take care of you. You are safe because I am here. And what's crazy about this phrase when Jesus tells us to deal with this in our storms in life is to be confident that I am here. Now, this isn't just him saying, I'm here, right? You're not by yourself with the ghost, right? He's saying, I am here. And how this really reads in the original language is kind of mistranslated a little bit when we get it into English, because what he's saying is, I am is here. The I am. The God of gods. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The God that spun the world into motion. That God is here. He's saying, take courage, don't be afraid, because I am is here. And when we face storms, I need you to understand, if you want to have firm footing in this storm, in the difficult times that happen in life, if you want to put this rung back into the ladder, then you and I have to be confident that I am is with us. God is with us. For here's the deal, and this is the most important that we get in this, is that fear subsides when someone we trust is in control. And if we're going to have firm footing so that our life, our faith, the whole progress of things don't derail when we face a storm, then we have to recognize that someone we can trust is in control. And that is a crucial piece of us having sure footing when it comes to storms in life. The story goes on and it says it this way. It says, then Peter called to him. He said, Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water. Now, I've got to be honest with you, sometimes Peter is a trip, isn't he? I mean, sometimes you get a hold of Peter's stories and you're like, seriously, that's what you came up with? I mean, the whole group of people sees this man walking on the water. They can't tell. They think it's a ghost. And Jesus says, don't worry, I am is here with you, right? And then Peter's response is, here, I bet I can figure out how to prove this. Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you. Like if it wasn't really him, would he just tell him and he'd fall in? He goes, tell me to come out there and walk in on the water. And then Jesus' response is powerful. But before we get to that, this is critical for us. We give Peter a lot of grief, right? We give Peter a lot of grief for what happens next because he takes his eyes off Jesus and he sinks and all those things. We give Peter a lot of grief. But can I just ask you this? When you face a storm, what is your tendency? Is your tendency to pray, get me out of this storm? Or do you want Jesus in the storm? And that's really what we need to do. If we're going to have a firm footing in storms in our life, maybe instead of praying, Jesus, get me out of this storm, consider praying what Peter kind of prayed. Jesus, what do you want me to get out of this storm? I'm in this storm. The natural tendency, at least my natural tendency, when I'm in a storm is, Jesus, please stop the storm, right? It's very rarely, Jesus, what do you want me to get out of this storm? It's what I love about Peter's faith. Peter runs off kind of half-cocked half the time, right? And he speaks, and then he goes, hey, I'm going to have to step out of here because I got more feet I need to put into my mouth. Like he has a tendency to speak and then think, and I get it. I feel that way many times. But I love his faith. Jesus, if it's you, tell me to come to you. Jesus, if it's you, tell me what you want me to get out of this storm. Jesus, instead of stopping the storm, instead of getting me out of the storm, what do you want me to get out of the storm? Jesus' response is very simple. It's very similar to what we'd say to a golden retriever. Yes, come here. You do it. He didn't give him instructions. He didn't say, hey, if you're going to do this, then what you got to do is position your body in a certain way and make sure that you step directly on. Don't step like this. Step directly on. No, he didn't say any of that stuff. He just said, come on out here. Because it wasn't the tactics of him weathering this part of the storm. It wasn't about how he put his feet or how he held his body. He just said, you are looking the right direction now. Come to me. And that is the craziest part about it, is we have a tendency sometimes to think about what he walked on, right? Or the circumstances he was walking in. But let me understand something. What he was walking toward is far more important. What he was walking toward was Jesus. And he had heard a word, yes, come, one word. But who he heard it from is far more important. Look at who he heard it from. John chapter 1 puts it this way in talking about Jesus. Says that in the beginning was the Word, that's Jesus. He was the Word. He already existed. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. We make a big deal sometimes about what he was walking on, the water, or what he was walking in, the storm. But what was most important was what he was walking toward. He was walking toward the Word. Toward the Word in the middle of the storm is a more important place to be. So Peter, right, does this thing where he wakes up in this moment and he steps out of the boat. He went over to the other side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. I told you we make a big deal about these prepositions, don't we? That he walked on the water. Now, Peter gets some grief in a second. In a second, he gets kind of sidetracked some stuff, but he stepped out of the boat. And I just want to mention this phrase to you that's so important that you get, that if you want to walk on water in the middle of a storm, you're going to have to get out of the boat. There's going to have to be a faith step here that recognizes that fear subsides when someone stronger is in control, and I'm not walking on water or in a storm, I'm walking toward the Word, and that is the important thing. But when Peter, when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. Now listen, here's the crazy part, is that we always tend to go, oh, well, Peter's kind of dumb for stepping out of the water, for saying, if you're not a ghost, tell me to come out there and I'll come out there. He wasn't dumb for that. He was faithful for that. We think he's a little less faithful, right? All of a sudden when he loses eyesight on Jesus and begins to sink. I think the most brilliant step of faith that Peter experienced in this entire moment is these few words: save me, Lord. He recognized what he needed in the sure footing, in the difficult storm in life. He was like, you're my only hope. I'm going under, and you are the only one that can save me. And so when we're in the middle of a storm in life, if we want sure footing, don't look for circumstances. If you want sure footing, don't look for friends' opinions. And if you want sure footing in the storm that you face in life, look for Jesus. Because what he was walking on the water isn't that important. What he was walking in, the storm, not that important. What he was walking toward, the Word, toward Jesus, that matters. And I don't know about you, and this is the very truth of life, is that I'd rather be in a storm with Jesus than anywhere else without him. Let me say that again. Because I'd rather be in a storm with Jesus than anywhere else without him. You see, sometimes in life we face these real life places where we live, don't we? We want to grow in our faith. We want to serve. We want to give, right? We want to be a good husband. We want to be a good father. We want to be a good employee. We want to be a good mom or a good sister. But the truth of it is that most of the time we get stuck on these things. We're doing well, and then all of a sudden our past kind of resurrects and winds up in our story, doesn't it? Or we doing well and we're growing in our faith and we're committed to things, and then all of a sudden we face some uncertainty. And our faith story, our life kind of derails for a minute, or we all of a sudden experience a storm in life, a diagnosis you didn't expect, a thing that kind of came up and all of a sudden everything seems to be swirling around you. Can I just remind you again of his words? Save me, Lord. Because I'd rather be in a storm with Jesus than anywhere else without him.